I had walked these trails my entire life. The Appalachian Mountains were a place that earned respect. Old, quiet, and always watching. I thought I knew every bend, every trail marker, and each trick of the light that made it seem darker than it really was. But then I saw that unfamiliar path stretching to the right, narrow and barely noticeable. I hesitated. I don't know what drew me to it. Maybe the way the trees arched over, or perhaps the strange silence that seemed even deeper than usual. Despite my better judgment, I turned and stepped into the unknown. After a few steps, the forest grew thicker. The sky was barely visible through the tangled branches, and the air tasted odd, like rust or blood. A sharp sting that burned my throat. The trees were dark and twisted, their trunks bent so low that some almost touched the ground. They looked scorched, as though a fire had swept through and stopped suddenly, leaving the place marked. I stopped, taking in the stillness, a heavy kind of quiet, as though even the birds had learned to avoid it. Then I saw it, a massive scar in the earth, a deep crater so vast I couldn't see the bottom. Charred roots jutted from the sides, clawing toward the center where something caught the light. I moved closer, my steps muffled by the dark dirt. As I reached the edge, I saw what was gleaming. It was a book, a small, worn leather journal, resting at the center of the pit. A shiver ran through me, but I couldn't leave it behind. I lowered myself into the hole, hands digging into the loose earth as I slid down. The journal was colder than I expected, colder than it should have been. The leather was cracked, and the words "Fallen Kingdom" were faintly embossed on the cover. Flipping it open, I saw disturbing sketches. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, strange symbols carved into stones, creatures drawn in heavy shadowed strokes. Each page seemed to pulse with something dark, something that didn't belong in the daylight. Then I saw a name scrawled on one of the pages, Lewis Caldwell. My blood froze. I knew that name. Lewis Caldwell was my uncle, the one who had vanished into these woods almost 20 years ago. They searched everywhere, combing every trail, every hollow, but they never found any trace of him. Yet here was his journal, as if it had been waiting for me. I looked up, suddenly feeling exposed, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the forest's edge. Shadows shifted at the corner of my vision, shapes that didn't match anything I recognized. The air grew colder, carrying a faint whisper that could have been the wind, but it felt deliberate. My legs tensed, and I scrambled up the side of the crater, clutching the journal tightly. I could feel something watching me, something aware that I had uncovered its secret. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and the forest seemed to close in around me, its silence pressing in, heavy and expectant. I walked faster, nearly jogging, with the journal weighing down my hands. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. By the time I reached the main trail, my heart was racing. I glanced back once, but the trees stood still, as if they had never seen me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had marked me. That night, sleep didn't come. The forest felt suffocating, pressing in on the cabin, a silent watcher waiting just out of reach. I had spent the whole afternoon reading the journal, deciphering Lewis's scrawled notes until the words blurred. I could feel him in every line, his terror, his disbelief. His sketches filled the margins, crude drawings of creatures he had seen in the woods, things that hid between the trees, half-formed faces peering from twisted shadows. One note appeared over and over, written in jagged, heavy handwriting. "Never look behind you." I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was curiosity or loyalty, a need to uncover the truth about Lewis. Whatever it was, it made me ignore the quiet voice in my head telling me to leave. Instead, I pocketed the journal, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the night. The darkness swallowed me whole. The trees were nothing but towering shadows, their gnarled arms blocking out the sliver of moonlight. I moved carefully down the path toward the clearing, feeling my way as if I were blind. Everything seemed sharper at night, the rustling leaves, the whisper of the wind threading through the branches. I kept my steps light, unwilling to disturb the silence. That's when I heard it, a faint crunch somewhere close, like leaves underfoot. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, circling me. I didn't dare turn, didn't want to know what might be watching me from behind. Lewis's words echoed in my head. Never look behind you. I kept moving, telling myself it was just the wind or some animal in the underbrush. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it. A weight just outside my line of sight, something following me, matching my steps. My hand tightened on the flashlight in my pocket, but I didn't dare pull it out. It felt like an admission, like if I turned it on, whatever was out there would know I was aware of it. The footsteps grew louder, each one deliberate, sinking into the silence, drawing closer. My skin prickled with each crunch of leaves, each snap of a twig. I took another step, holding my breath, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, soft but clear, calling my name. A shiver crawled up my spine, icy fingers twisting through my gut. I kept my eyes forward, my pulse pounding in my ears, but that whisper, God, it sounded so close, like someone was standing right behind me. Leaning in, their breath warm against my neck. I could feel its presence, the space it took up in the dark, a cold, patient shadow. I forced myself to keep moving, each step feeling heavier, as though the whisper was following me, relentless, echoing through the silent trees. My mind raced, recalling the stories in Lewis's journal of shadows that took shape, creatures waiting in the dark. I had thought it was just his imagination, his fear. Now I wasn't so sure. Finally, I saw the cabin through the trees, its outline a lifeline in the darkness. I didn't look back, not even when the footsteps stopped, fading into the night. The forest fell silent once more, but I felt it. Even as I crossed the threshold and bolted the door, whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was waiting. I didn't wait long. Something about the stillness felt too heavy, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I zipped up my bag, cramming the journal into my coat pocket. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around me, pressing me toward the door. I had told myself I would find answers here, but all I had found was fear. Whatever was out there wasn't something I could understand or confront. It was something older, something that didn't want me here. I stepped outside, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. My flashlight barely pierced the dark, its beam shaking as my hands trembled. The silence felt thicker tonight, heavier. I walked quickly, telling myself I just needed to reach the main trail, and everything would be fine. But I could feel it, whatever it was, lurking behind me, just out of sight but never out of mind. My heart pounded in my chest, drowning out the sound of my boots on the dirt. Then I heard it, a low, throaty growl, rumbling from deep in the woods. It was close, far too close, and it wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. I froze, clutching the flashlight, its light trembling as I held it toward the sound. The darkness shifted, something moving just beyond the beam's reach. I caught a glimpse of antlers twisting toward the sky, forming a grotesque crown above a hulking shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its eyes, burning yellow, fixed on me, locking me in place like prey caught in a trap. My legs moved before I knew what I was doing. I turned and ran, tearing down the trail as fast as I could, the journal thumping against my chest with each step. I could hear it behind me, its heavy, deliberate steps closing the distance. Branches lashed at my face, thorns scraping my arms, but I kept going, heart pounding, lungs burning. The trail twisted, and I stumbled, nearly losing my footing. When I looked up, my heart sank. I had come full circle. I was back at the crater, the very place I had tried to leave behind. The beast stood at the edge of the pit, its shadow spilling over the earth, waiting. Its eyes glowed brighter, and a sickening growl rumbled from deep within. I backed away, but the ground beneath me was loose, crumbling. Panic seized me, and for a moment, I thought I might fall into the pit. I reached into my pocket and clutched the journal, gripping Lewis's words like a lifeline. There was a phrase, a desperate incantation he had written to keep the shadows at bay. My voice barely rose above a whisper, but I forced the words out, repeating them louder as the beast drew closer. For a moment, it paused, as if the words had struck it. Its yellow eyes flickered, just for an instant. I took my chance. I scrambled up the edge of the crater, lunged forward, and sprinted through the trees. My legs felt like they would give out any second, but I kept moving, tearing through the forest, every breath ragged. When I finally saw the main trail ahead, I didn't look back. I burst from the trees, collapsing on the dirt path. The forest silence crashed down behind me, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it waiting for the next time I dared to return. And a part of me knew that if I did, I would never leave. I worked as a logger, spending my days in the forest chopping down trees for a new housing project. To be honest, I didn't feel great about clearing the land and cutting down trees, but it paid the bills. The forest itself was beautiful and peaceful most of the time, even if it did have its strange moments. The other guys I worked with had found abandoned tents, jackets, and even shoes left behind, but some stories were downright creepy. Once, someone found bones that couldn't be identified, still talked about as the remains of someone who disappeared without a trace. I always thought these stories were just to scare us, but that was before my last week out there. That evening, just before sunset, I went a little further into the woods to get some privacy. I could still hear my two coworkers laughing and talking near the truck, but their voices were faint. I kept walking deeper into the forest, careful of thorny branches or rocks. It was just about 6 p.m., and the light was fading fast. In the winter, it got dark earlier, so we usually packed up by now. I had wandered farther than I should have, but the guys knew I'd be back soon. As I stood there, I suddenly heard a loud snap, a branch breaking nearby. My heart started beating faster. I turned slightly, thinking it was one of my coworkers trying to mess with me. "Nice try, guys," I muttered under my breath, though I felt uneasy. Then I heard another crack, even closer this time, followed by a low, strange laugh. It didn't sound quite right. It had a rasp to it, but I convinced myself it was just them messing around. "Come on, guys," I called out louder. "Let's get out of here, it's getting cold." They didn't answer. I zipped up my jacket, feeling a chill run down my spine. Something didn't feel right. As the last bits of daylight disappeared, the forest felt unnervingly quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then there was another snap, this time from behind a thick, shadowy tree. I spun around, and there it was, a figure tall and strange, half hidden behind a tree about 50 yards away. It was about my height, maybe a little taller, but its head was odd, almost too big, and its eyes red, glowing like embers in the shadows. I froze, unable to move. A thin trail of steam rose from its body in the cold air. It looked like it was breathing heavily, almost like a growl. I could hear every rough, raspy breath. My feet felt glued to the ground. I couldn't tell what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't anything normal. I took a shaky step back, then another, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Finally, I forced myself to turn and run back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but I kept running, hearing only silence behind me. Even when I reached the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. The next morning, I still felt that same chill from the night before, as though something had followed me back. I barely slept, haunted by the memory of those red eyes and the strange, rough breathing that had echoed through the trees. When I arrived at the job site, the guys were already there, talking in low voices. They looked up when I arrived, and I could tell they were just as spooked as I was, even though they didn't want to admit it. Our boss didn't believe us when we told him what we'd seen. He laughed it off. "You boys have been reading too many ghost stories. It's just shadows and wildlife out there." Then he shrugged. "Now get back to work. These trees aren't going to cut themselves." I didn't argue, but I could tell the others were still on edge. None of us wanted to be there, especially after what we'd seen, but we had no choice. We got to the clearing where we'd been cutting down trees and went straight to work. I tried to focus on my job, trying to ignore the way the forest felt. It was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Normally, we'd hear birds or squirrels or the wind rustling the leaves, but now there was nothing. Just the hum of the chainsaws and the crunch of our boots on the cold, hard ground. Every so often, I'd glance up, scanning the trees. I knew it was out there. I could feel it, but the forest looked empty. My skin prickled, and every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. The guys were jumpy too. Every time I glanced over, one of them was looking around, squinting into the shadows, just like me. The silence wrapped around us, growing heavier with every hour. Finally, as we were packing up to leave, I heard it again. A growl, deep and low, coming from the south. My heart started pounding. The other guys froze, and I saw the fear flash in their eyes. None of us wanted to move, but we had to know if it was out there. Slowly, we all turned toward the sound, squinting into the fading light. First, there was nothing, just shadows between the trees. Then one of the guys whispered, "There," and pointed. My stomach twisted as I spotted it, the creature from last night. It was closer now, standing still, watching us. Its red eyes blazed in the dim light. I could see the strange shape of its head and the thin steam rising from its skin. It looked more terrifying in the daylight than it had in the dark. Without thinking, my coworker reached into the truck, pulled out a pistol from the glove box, and aimed. Crack. He fired once, then twice, and we saw the creature stumble. The shots hit it in the leg and chest, but it didn't fall. It let out an angry snarl before retreating back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. We jumped into the truck, barely speaking, and drove back to camp. My heart was racing. My mind was spinning. I didn't know what we had seen, but I knew one thing. Whatever it wasn't going to leave us alone. I didn't want to go back into that forest after what we'd seen. I was ready to quit, to walk away from logging altogether, but we didn't have much of a choice. Our boss was firm, show up or get fired. So, there we were, the three of us heading back into the woods as the sun began to rise. Our breath was visible in the cold morning air. The ride was quiet. Nobody spoke. We were all thinking the same thing. Those red eyes and that awful, heavy breathing. My hands were shaking as we parked the truck and got out, each of us carrying our gear, without a word. Every step felt heavier as we moved toward the clearing. The forest was completely silent, not even a bird chirping. It felt like we had walked into a graveyard. We started our work quickly, eager to get it done and get out. None of us wanted to be there longer than necessary, but as the hours passed, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch one of the other guys doing the same. We didn't say anything, but I knew they felt it too. The air was thick with tension, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, we started packing up the equipment, ready to leave. That's when I heard it, the growl. My blood turned to ice as the sound filled the clearing, low and menacing, coming from somewhere to the south. I saw my friends freeze, their eyes wide with fear. We turned, looking toward the trees, but saw nothing. The growl grew louder, echoing around us. It was closer this time, a horrible, rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. One of the guys pointed, and I followed his gaze. There, at the edge of the clearing, was the creature. Its red eyes glowed, staring straight at us. It looked bigger now, angrier. I could see the dark spots where the bullets had hit it, but it didn't seem hurt. If anything, it looked more furious, like it was out for revenge. My coworker with the pistol raised it again, his hands shaking. He fired once, then twice, but the creature didn't even flinch. It took a step toward us, its growl turning into a snarl. My heart pounded as we backed up, moving toward the truck, never taking our eyes off it. "Get in!" I shouted, and we scrambled into the truck, slamming the doors behind us. The creature lunged forward, slamming into the side of the truck with a force that rocked us sideways. It let out a horrible scream, a sound I'll never forget, half roar, half wail, like it was something not of this world. My friend floored the gas, and we sped down the dirt road, away from the clearing, away from the thing that haunted the forest. As we hit the main road, the growling faded, but the memory of those red eyes stayed with us. We didn't talk much on the ride back, but we all knew one thing. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking in the dark trees. My name's Henry, and last week, I decided to go out on my own to a secret fishing spot deep in the woods of Vermont, a place my friend Will had told me about. He'd found it just a few days earlier and promised it was filled with big fish. Sadly, he couldn't join me because his daughter was ill, so I had to go alone. I tried my best to follow his directions, but it took me longer than expected, winding through dense trees and rough trails. The air was strangely quiet. Usually, in the woods, I'd hear birds, bugs, or maybe a squirrel, but here it was silent, except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of branches. At one point, I stopped because it felt like something was watching me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but a chill ran down my back. After what felt like hours, I finally made it to the spot, but what I found wasn't a pond. It was much bigger, more like a small, murky lake. Dark water stretched out before me, with shadows from the trees surrounding it, making the place feel eerie. I sat down on a large, decaying log by the shore, unpacked my gear, and got ready to fish. The stillness of the place was unsettling. Usually, by water, you'd hear frogs, bugs, or the occasional splash, but here, there was nothing. I cast my line, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was all in my head. After catching a couple of small fish, I suddenly heard a noise from across the water, a sloshing sound, like something moving through the water. Squinting, I tried to make out what it was, but the shadows made it hard to see. Then I spotted it, something crouched by the water, drinking. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but it was hunched oddly, almost like it had too many joints or its legs bent in the wrong direction. The skin was shiny, like fish scales, which didn't make sense. My heart pounded as I watched it lift its head, but it was too far to make out any details. Just as I started to convince myself it was just an animal, the creature moved forward and slid into the water without a sound. I tried to focus on fishing again, but my nerves were on edge. Something about this place felt wrong, like I didn't belong. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity kept me there, waiting for any sign of movement. Just then, My fishing pole jerked harder than any fish I'd ever caught. Before I could grab it, the pole flew out of my hands and into the water. Stunned, I stared at the ripples spreading across the pond, my heart racing. Something under that dark water was strong enough to pull my pole from my hands. I looked around, but the surface of the pond was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. There was something in that water, something I couldn't see, and it wanted to stay hidden. A chill crept down my spine, like icy fingers on my back. I decided it was time to leave. I might have been overreacting, but there was no way I was sticking around to find out what had grabbed my pole. My hands shook as I packed up, every little noise making me flinch. Even the silence felt different, thicker, as if the forest was holding its breath. Just as I swung my backpack over my shoulder, I heard it. A soft sloshing sound, unmistakable, coming from right behind me. My body stiffened, and my heart thumped in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, gripping my pocket knife, though I knew it was no match for whatever was out there. That's when I saw it. Just a few yards away, dripping with water and mud, stood the creature I had seen across the pond. But up close, it was even worse. It was bigger than I'd realized, standing on all fours with a strange, twisted posture. Its skin was slimy, scaly, and a sickly green with darker patches. It had long, webbed fingers that ended in sharp claws, and its mouth. Oh, its mouth was wide, stretching almost too far across its face, filled with tiny needle-like teeth. The worst part was its eyes. Small, black, and cold, like it was looking right through me. Its neck was lined with pulsing gills that flared in and out, making a wet, wheezing sound with every breath. The stench hit me then, a thick, rotting smell, like something left to decay in the sun for days. The creature stared at me, then took a slow, deliberate step forward, hissing, its mouth curling into what seemed like a sick grin. I raised my knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much. My hands trembled, but I wasn't going down without a fight. Then, in an instant, it lunged. Instinct kicked in. I swung the knife as hard as I could, hitting one of its gills. It screeched, stumbling back, thick black sludge pouring from the wound. It flinched and snarled at me. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it turned and fled, slinking back into the pond. I didn't hesitate. I dropped everything and ran, crashing through the forest, not daring to look back. By the time I made it to my truck, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. My heart was racing, and I felt like the creature's eyes were still watching me from the woods. I couldn't shake the image of its scaly, slimy skin, that wide grin full of sharp teeth, and the sound of its gills breathing. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it chasing me. When I finally made it home, I called Will. At first, he didn't believe me, but there was something in my voice that made him agree to meet up the next day and go back to the pond to see if there was any proof of what I'd seen. As much as I wanted to avoid that place, I needed someone else to see it, so I knew I wasn't losing my mind. The next day, Will picked me up, and we drove in silence. The closer we got, the more my stomach twisted with dread. As we walked through the woods, every noise seemed louder, every shadow darker. Even Will, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, was silent, his eyes scanning the trees. When we finally reached the pond, it looked exactly as it had the day before, dark and quiet. But then I saw them. Footprints, huge, webbed, clawed, leading from the water to the spot where I had been sitting. I pointed them out to Will, my throat dry. He stopped laughing, his face going pale. He crouched to get a closer look. "These are too big for any animal," he whispered, staring at the prints. I nodded, too scared to speak. The prints were deep, like something heavy had stepped there, and they led straight into the water, disappearing into the pond's black surface. We stood there in silence, staring at the water, when we heard a soft splash from across the pond. We both turned at the same time, and a ripple moved across the water, slow and eerie, as if something was swimming just below the surface. The smell hit us then, a rotten stench that made me gag. The ripple grew closer, and then I saw it. The creature's head broke the surface, its black eyes staring straight at us. The gills on its neck pulsed with each breath, making that sickening, wet noise. Will grabbed my arm, his face filled with terror. "We need to leave," he whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We backed away slowly, eyes locked on the creature as it watched us. Just as we turned to run, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent a chill through my entire body. We ran faster than I've ever run, crashing through branches, not stopping until we were back at the truck. We never went back to that pond. I'm Mark, and last week, I decided to go on a solo trip to a secluded fishing spot deep in the woods of North Carolina that my friend Jake had told me about. He said it was filled with big fish, and though he'd only discovered it recently, he swore it was worth the effort. Unfortunately, his daughter was ill, so he couldn't join me, and I was left to explore on my own. I tried my best to follow his directions, though they were harder to remember than I thought. The journey took longer than expected as I wound my way through thick trees and rugged paths. The air was eerily still. Usually, when I'm in the woods, I hear birds, bugs, maybe a squirrel or two, but here, nothing. Only the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the soft rustling of branches. At one point, I paused, a sense of being watched creeping up on me. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the chill that ran down my spine wouldn't go away. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the spot, but it wasn't a pond. It was more like a small, murky lake. Dark water stretched out before me, and the shadows from the thick trees around it made the whole place feel gloomy. I found a rotting log by the shore and sat down, unpacking my gear to fish. The silence was strange. Usually, by the water, there's a chorus of frogs, bugs, or splashes. But here, there was nothing, just stillness. I cast my line, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After a while, I caught a couple of small fish when I heard something across the water. It was a sloshing sound, like something moving through the water. I squinted to get a better look, but the shadows from the trees made it hard. Then I saw it, a creature crouched by the water's edge, drinking. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear, but it was hunched strangely, as if its joints bent the wrong way. Its skin glimmered oddly, like fish scales, which made no sense. My heart raced as I watched it raise its head, but it was too far for me to make out any details. Just as I started to convince myself it was some normal animal, it moved forward and slipped into the water without a sound. I tried to focus on fishing again, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right here, that I didn't belong. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot, watching the water, waiting for any sign of movement. That's when my fishing pole jerked more violently than I'd ever felt before. Before I could react, it flew out of my hands and into the water. I sat there, stunned, staring at the ripples where my pole had just disappeared. My heart was pounding, my hands numb. I'd fished all my life, but I had never felt anything strong enough to yank a pole out of my hands like that. Whatever was in that dark water wasn't normal. I looked around, my eyes darting between the shadows cast by the trees. Seconds passed, and the surface of the pond was still again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was down there, something I couldn't see, something that wanted to stay hidden. A chill crept over me, like icy fingers on my spine. It was time to leave. Maybe I was overreacting, but there was no way I was staying to find out what had pulled my pole into that dark water. My hands shook as I started packing up, every sound making me flinch. Even the silence seemed different, thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. Just as I slung my backpack over my shoulder, I heard it. A soft, sloshing sound, unmistakable, coming from right behind me. My body froze, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. Slowly, I turned around, gripping my pocket knife, though I knew it wouldn't protect me from whatever was out there. That's when I saw it. Standing just a few yards away, dripping with water and mud, was the creature I'd seen across the pond. Up close, it was even worse. It was bigger than I'd thought, standing on all fours with a twisted stance. Its skin was slimy and scaly, a sickly green with darker patches. It had long, webbed fingers ending in sharp claws, and its mouth was wrong. It stretched wide, almost unnaturally so, filled with tiny, needle-like teeth. Its eyes were small, black, and cold, like it was looking right through me. The creature's neck was lined with pulsing gills, which flared in and out with a wet, wheezing noise. I gagged at the smell, a rotting stench that made me want to vomit. The creature stared at me and then took a slow, deliberate step forward, letting out a low hiss. Its mouth curled into something like a sick grin. I raised my knife even though I knew it wouldn't do much. My hands trembled, but I wasn't going down without a fight. Suddenly, it lunged. Instinct kicked in, and I swung the knife as hard as I could, striking its neck, hitting one of its gills. The creature let out a high-pitched screech and stumbled back, thick black sludge oozing from the wound. It snarled at me before turning and fleeing, slinking back into the pond. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Dropping everything, I ran, crashing through the forest, not daring to look back. By the time I reached my truck, I was shaking so much I could barely get the key in the ignition. My heart was racing, and I still felt its eyes on me, watching from somewhere deep in the woods. I couldn't get the image of that creature out of my mind. Its slimy, scaly skin, its wide, grinning mouth, and the awful sound of its gills. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it chasing me. As soon as I got home, I called Jake. He didn't believe me at first, who would? But something in my voice must have convinced him. He agreed to meet me the next day and go back to the pond to see if there was any proof of what I had seen. As much as I didn't want to go back, I needed someone else to witness it, just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The next day, Jake picked me up, and we drove in silence to the trail. The closer we got, the more my stomach twisted with dread. As we walked through the forest, it was like every noise was louder, every shadow darker. Even Jake, who usually cracked jokes to lighten the mood, was silent, his eyes scanning the trees. When we reached the pond, everything looked just as it had before, still dark and quiet. But then I saw them. Footprints, huge, webbed, and clawed, leading from the water to the very spot where I'd been sitting the day before. I pointed them out to Jake, my throat dry. He stopped laughing, his face going pale as he crouched to get a closer look. "These are too big for any animal," he whispered, staring at the prints. I nodded, too scared to speak. The prints were deep, like something heavy had stepped there, and they led straight into the water, disappearing beneath the black surface. We both stood there in silence, staring at the water when we heard a soft splash from across the pond. Jake and I turned at the same time. A ripple moved across the water, slow and eerie, like something was swimming just below the surface. The stench hit us then, a foul, rotting odor that made me gag. The ripple grew closer, and soon a shape rose just above the water. The creature's head broke the surface, those black, soulless eyes staring straight at us. Its gills pulsed, making that sick, wet sound with each breath. Jake grabbed my arm, his face filled with horror. "We need to leave," he whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the creature as it watched us. Just as we turned to run, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills through my entire body. We ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through branches, not stopping until we were back at the truck. We never went back to that pond. When I arrived at the cabin that summer, I was eager to see my cousins. Everything around here felt new. The trees were taller, the air smelled cleaner, and it was much quieter than back in the city. My cousins Lucas, Sarah, and Eli were already sitting on the front porch waiting for me. From the look on Lucas's face, I could tell he had something in mind. It was after dinner, and we were relaxing on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The adults were inside, chatting and laughing, just like they always did. Not long after I got there, Lucas leaned in and whispered, "How about we go camping tonight?" Sarah immediately frowned. "You know Grandma and Grandpa won't let us go out there after dark," she said, glancing at the house. "They've told us 100 times not to go into the woods at night." Lucas shrugged and flashed us his usual grin. "That's why we won't tell them," he said. A thrill of excitement ran through me, though I felt a little nervous. "We could just ask them," I suggested, even though I already knew what Lucas would say. "They'll just say no," he replied, waving his hand. "Come on, it'll be fun. We can set up a tent, tell stories, and be back before sunrise. They won't even know." Eli, who was only 11, looked unsure. "What if we get caught?" he asked, nervously glancing at the house. Sarah looked at me, considering. I was excited, but a small part of me felt uneasy. Then again, what could go wrong? All the kids back at school would say, "Whoa, hello." So I agreed. "Okay, but we have to be careful." Eli sighed but eventually nodded, still looking worried. By midnight, the adults were asleep. We could hear Grandma and Grandpa snoring in their room as we crept past, careful not to step on any creaky floorboards. We quietly slipped out the back door into the cool night. The forest felt different in the dark. During the day, we knew these paths well, but now they seemed darker, even with the moonlight filtering through the trees. Every sound was sharper, every shadow a little scarier. A branch snapped somewhere off to our left, and we all jumped, but Lucas just laughed, trying to lighten the mood. After about 20 minutes, we reached the creek, where a small clearing lay surrounded by trees. Setting up the tent was harder than we thought without a flashlight, but we finally managed it. Once it was up, we huddled around a small battery-powered lantern. Its faint glow was enough to light our faces, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. Lucas rubbed his hands together with a grin. "All right, who has a good story?" Sarah's eyes brightened in the dim light. "I've got one," she said. "Have you guys ever heard of the Raven Mocker?" Eli hugged his knees, looking uneasy. "I don't like that one," he muttered. But Lucas leaned in, clearly excited. We sat in a tight circle, our faces half lit by the lantern's glow as Sarah began. "The Raven Mocker is a spirit that steals the hearts of the dying. It takes the years they should have lived and keeps them for itself." She paused, meeting our eyes. "It can appear as a raven or even as a person, but only medicine men can see it in its true form." Eli's face went pale. "Do we have to talk about this?" he whispered, his eyes darting around, as if expecting something to swoop out of the darkness. Lucas grinned. "It's just a story, Eli," he said, though I could tell he was a little nervous too. "And besides, I have one that's even scarier." Sarah rolled her eyes, but I shivered when Lucas began. "Have you ever heard of the Deer Woman?" They say she looks like a beautiful woman to lure people into the woods. Once she's got you far enough, she changes." He paused, leaning in with a wide-eyed look. "She has hooves for feet and a face like a stag." I glanced at the shadows outside, my throat tightening. The thought of something pretending to be human was chilling, and the idea that something like that might be out there in the dark made me feel like we weren't alone. "All right, enough," Eli said, hugging his knees. "Can we talk about something else?" I decided to jump in, hoping to shift the mood. "What about the Star People legend? They're supposed to be peaceful. They come from the stars to teach us wisdom, and they're not scary." Lucas rolled his eyes. "That's boring," he said. But then his expression grew serious. "My grandpa told me something once, something he swore was true." Sarah's face darkened. "Lucas, don't." But Lucas was undeterred. "He said when he was our age, he saw a skinwalker." The tent fell silent. We all knew about skinwalkers, but none of us liked to talk about them, even the adults. "A skinwalker is a witch," Lucas whispered, "who can turn into animals to do dark magic. My grandpa was out gathering wood with his dad, but they got separated. Then, in the middle of the clearing, he saw a coyote standing on two legs, staring right at him." Sarah whispered, "Lucas, stop." But she looked as curious as I felt. "He thought he was imagining things," Lucas continued, his face pale. "But then the coyote started walking toward him. His body twisted and changed. It had the face of a man, stretched tight over its skull, and it whispered his name." Eli shuddered, holding onto my arm. "I think we should sleep," he said, his voice shaky. Just as we were about to settle down, we heard something outside, a soft dragging sound, like feet moving through leaves. We froze, staring at each other in terror. The sound grew louder, getting closer. Lucas turned to us, his face drained of color. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. The shuffling came closer with each step, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, and Eli was gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. Even Lucas looked terrified. "What is that?" Eli whispered. Lucas pressed a finger to his lips and slowly reached for the flashlight. His hand trembled as he unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. We all huddled behind him, straining to see. The flashlight beam swept across the trees, first revealing only shadows and branches. But then something moved. A figure emerged from behind a tree, and my spine went cold. It looked like a coyote, but not like any coyote I'd ever seen. Its body was twisted and stretched, with long, bony limbs that didn't quite fit, and patches of fur were missing. The worst part was its face. It was like someone had stretched a human face over a coyote's skull. Its eyes were dark, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The creature moved in jerky, unnatural steps, circling our tent. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound. It didn't seem to notice us, at least not yet. It was looking around, its head jerking from side to side, as if it were searching for something. Sarah covered her mouth to keep from screaming, and Eli's grip on my arm tightened. Lucas slowly lowered the tent flap and turned off the flashlight. We all huddled together, barely breathing, hoping it would go away. The shuffling grew louder, coming closer to the tent. Then, in a raspy, distorted voice, we heard it speak. "Help me?" It whispered, each word sounding wrong. Too low, too harsh, as if it were trying to trick us. "Please, help me," it repeated, and Eli began to shake, tears in his eyes. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder, signaling him to stay quiet. We were frozen, not daring to move. The creature pressed against the tent fabric, close enough that we could see its shadow stretching and distorting. A terrible, rotten smell filled the air, like decay mixed with sulfur. I clenched my eyes shut, silently pleading for it to go away. Finally, After what felt like hours, the shuffling noise faded. We stayed frozen, too scared to move, as the sounds moved farther away until the forest was silent again. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, we scrambled out of the tent and ran home, leaving everything behind. None of us dared to look back. The ranch looked even bigger at sunset, with long shadows stretching across the fields. Dad had given me a big task that evening, one he usually wouldn't let me do alone. "Lucas, I need that section of trees cleared out," he said. "It's out by the edge of the property. Pays well if you get it done." He offered more money than usual, and I knew why. Those woods were thick and wild, a place we rarely ventured. But I was saving for a truck, so it seemed worth it. That night, I packed up my gear and set my alarm for early morning. By the time I loaded up the truck with the chainsaw, gas, lunch, and camping gear, the sun was already high. Dad had said I might need to stay overnight just in case, and I didn't mind. It was just trees. How scary could it be? The drive was rough, bumpier than usual. The trees began to close in around me as I got farther, their branches scratching at the sides of the truck, and the sunlight started to fade the deeper I went into the woods. Eventually, I reached the clearing, an overgrown patch of trees. It was eerily quiet, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I paused for a moment, feeling a strange sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. But when I turned, there was no one there. I shook it off and got to work. The chainsaw roared to life, echoing through the empty woods as I cut the first few trees. It felt good to be working, and I quickly forgot about the odd feeling. But as the hours passed, strange things started happening. One tree I cut just vanished. I swear I had cut it down. The stump was cleanly sliced, but the tree itself was gone. I walked around, searching, but it was gone. I shook my head, convincing myself I must have dragged it off without realizing. When I took a break, the uneasy feeling returned, but stronger this time. It felt like someone was standing just outside my line of sight. I turned quickly, but the trees and shadows were all I saw. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard laughter, soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. I told myself it was just in my head. I was alone, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. I tried to focus on the next tree, but every time I glanced up, the shadows seemed to creep closer, shifting when I wasn't looking. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie golden light over the clearing, the woods felt even more unsettling. When night finally came, I decided to set up camp and finish the job in the morning. I built a small fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. But as I sat staring into the dark woods, I felt that strange sensation again, stronger than ever. It felt like eyes were watching me from every shadow, waiting for me to make a wrong move. The forest, once a place of freedom, felt like it was closing in, holding its breath. Darkness settled over the clearing, swallowing everything beyond the light of my little fire. I sat close to the flames, but the warmth didn't shake the chill that had crept over me. It felt like the woods were alive, breathing slowly, heavily. I could almost feel the shadows cast by the fire moving, but each time I looked, they seemed to freeze as if they didn't want me to notice. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. While eating, I heard it again, a soft rustling just outside the light. I shone my flashlight around, but all I could see were trees, looming like they were closing in on me. Then, out of nowhere, came the laughter again, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like someone just beyond the fire's edge, laughing softly, like they were watching me and finding it all amusing. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. Not a sound, just the crackling fire and my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I flashed the light through the trees, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I sat back down, trying to stay warm and alert, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I didn't want to think about what could be out there, hiding just beyond the trees and the shadows. The stories Dad had told me when I was younger about things in the woods, things that weren't animals, flooded my mind. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Finally, after what felt like hours, I crawled into my tent, hoping I could block it all out and sleep. But as soon as I zipped the tent shut, a loud thump jolted me awake. I froze, listening hard. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. The sound came from near the truck, followed by slow, heavy breathing, too close. My hand trembled as I unzipped the tent just a crack, peeking out into the moonlit clearing. Everything looked still, the truck and trailer parked where I'd left them. But then I saw it, just a glimpse, a tall, thin shadow slipping behind a tree. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I lay there stiff, eyes wide open, listening, feeling the forest closing in around me, like it was waiting for me to make one wrong move. I barely made it through the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the heavy breathing, closer than before. When the first light of dawn broke, I scrambled out of the tent, packed up as fast as I could, and jumped into the truck. My hands were shaking so much it took several tries to get the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, leaving the forest, and whatever was in it, behind me. When I got home, I didn't tell Dad everything. I just said I'd had trouble with the trailer and didn't want to stay overnight. He looked at me funny, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in days, but he didn't ask any more questions. He just said we'd go back in the morning to retrieve the trailer I'd left behind. The drive back to the clearing felt slower than ever. Everything looked different in the daylight, almost normal. The shadows were gone, and the trees didn't seem to close in the same way, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I could still feel that unease creeping back, reminding me of every sound, every breath I had heard in the dark. When we reached the clearing, the trailer was exactly where I'd left it, still loaded with logs. I helped Dad hook it up to the truck, but as we worked, I felt eyes on me again. I glanced at the trees, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving, tall and thin, slipping behind a tree. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. On the drive home, that image of the shadow stayed in my mind. I had to know what I'd seen. After Dad went to bed, I snuck into his study. He kept a lot of old books in there, mostly about history, but some were about local legends and folklore. I hadn't paid much attention to them before, but I grabbed one and flipped through it until something caught my eye. A chapter on creatures said to lurk in the deep woods. My hands shook as I read about a creature called the Lurker. It was described as a twisted, shadowy figure that preyed on those who wandered alone in the woods. Known for hiding behind trees, staying just out of sight, and following its victim patiently, it sounded just like the laughter, the breathing, and the shadow I had seen. The next day, I mentioned it to Dad, pretending it was no big deal. He looked at me strangely, then told me that my great-grandfather used to talk about creatures like that, shadows in the woods that no one could explain. He said some of the locals still refused to go too deep into the forest at night. Now I understood why. Now, every time I pass the edge of our property, I feel it. The same prickling, the same heavy sensation like someone's watching. And deep down, I know that something's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I won't be going back anytime soon.